The dress arrived in pieces. It came to the back door of St. Agatha's church in a cardboard box that had been rained on, taped over, rained on again, and carried through the streets of the old quarter by a man in a black overcoat who placed it on the stone step with the careful reverence of someone delivering a coffin. The man's name was Luca, and he worked for Emilio Saranova, and the box contained the only thing in the world that Emilio Saranova could not replace. Emilio did not come to the church himself. He had not entered a church since his mother's funeral 14 months ago, and he would not enter one now, not even to deliver the ruins of the dress that had been her most treasured possession. He sent Luca because Luca was trustworthy and because the task required a delicacy that Emilio could not summon. The delicacy of handling something sacred that had been destroyed. The dress had been his mother's wedding gown. Ivory silk, hand-sewn in 1979 by a seamstress in the old quarter, whose name had been lost to time, but whose craftsmanship had not. The bodice was structured with tiny pearl buttons that ran from the nape of the neck to the small of the back. 43 buttons, his mother had told him, one for every year of her own mother's life. The skirt was layered tulle over silk, with hand-embroidered vines along the hem that had taken the seamstress 3 months to complete. The veil was cathedral length, secured by a comb of silver filigree that had been in the family for 4 generations. His mother, Rosa Saranova, had worn the dress on the happiest day of her life, and she had kept it for 44 years in a cedar chest at the foot of her bed, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper and lavender sachets. She had shown it to Emilio when he was a boy, lifting the lid of the chest and pulling back the tissue with the ceremonial gravity of a priest revealing a relic. She had told him the story of every pearl button, every embroidered vine, every stitch that the seamstress had placed with the patience and precision of a woman who understood that a wedding dress is not a garment, but a vessel, a container for hope and promise and the belief that love, despite all evidence to the contrary, is capable of lasting. Rosa died 14 months ago. Cancer, the common kind, the kind that gives you time to say goodbye, but not enough time to say everything. Emilio had been at her bedside in the house where he had grown up, the house he had bought for her, with the first real money his organization had generated, and he had held her hand and listened to her breathing slow, and felt the particular helplessness of a man who could move mountains and rearrange the power structures of an entire city, but could not keep one woman's lungs filling with air. After her death, the house had been broken into, not by rivals, not by enemies, not by anyone with a strategic motive, but by common thieves, opportunists who had read the obituary and calculated that the house of a recently deceased woman might contain valuables worth taking. They had been right. They had taken jewelry and silver and a small safe that contained cash, and they had found the cedar chest at the foot of the bed and opened it and found the wedding dress, and, finding it worthless by their standards, unsellable, an object whose value was entirely sentimental, they had torn it apart looking for hidden jewelry sewn into the lining. They had ripped the bodice from the skirt. They had pulled the pearl buttons from their threads, scattering them across the bedroom floor like teeth knocked from a mouth. They had torn the embroidered hem and shredded the veil and left the dress in pieces on the floor of his mother's bedroom, discarded, ruined, a casualty of the particular cruelty that occurs when people who understand nothing about value encounter something priceless. Emilio had found the dress when he came to the house 3 days later. He had stood in his mother's bedroom, surrounded by the wreckage of a burglary that his security should have prevented, and he had looked at the torn ivory silk and the scattered pearl buttons and the shredded veil, and something inside him that had been holding together since the funeral, some load-bearing wall of composure and control, had collapsed. He had gathered the pieces, every fragment of silk, every pearl button he could find on the floor, every scrap of embroidered tulle. He had placed them in a cardboard box with hands that shook so badly he could barely close the lid, and he had sent Luca to the church, St. Agatha's, where Rosa had been married in 1979, where the dress had first been worn, where the priest who had blessed the marriage was long dead, but the stones of the building remembered, with instructions to leave the box and a note asking Father Matteo if anyone in the parish could repair a damaged garment. Father Matteo had placed the box in the vestry. He had opened it, looked at the contents, understood the scale of the damage, and shaken his head with the gentle resignation of a man who had spent 40 years in the service of God and had learned that some things, once broken, stay broken. The box sat in the vestry for 3 weeks, and then Zara Khoury found it. Zara Khoury had been sleeping in St. Agatha's church for 5 months. Not in the pews. She was too proud for that, too aware that sleeping in a pew was the posture of someone who had given up, who had arranged themselves for public viewing in their defeat. She slept in the vestry, in a narrow space between the storage shelves and the wall, on a bedroll she had made from blankets donated to the church's charity bin. She had a pillow she had sewn herself from fabric scraps. She had a small battery-powered lantern. She had a sewing kit, not a household sewing kit with plastic thimbles and blunt needles, but a professional kit in a leather roll, containing 47 needles of varying gauges, 12 spools of silk thread in as many colors, beeswax for strengthening thread, a bone folder, a seam ripper, tailor's chalk, and a pair of steel shears so sharp they could cut silk without dragging. The sewing kit was the only thing she had kept from her previous life. Everything else, the apartment, the workshop, the clients, the reputation she had built over 8 years as one of the most skilled seamstresses in the city's bridal district, had been lost in the collapse that follows when a person without safety nets encounters a crisis without mercy. Her crisis had a name: her ex-husband, Ferris, who had accumulated debts in her name, forged her signature on loan documents, and disappeared to another country when the creditors came calling. The debts were enormous. The legal process was slow. The eviction was fast. Within 4 months of discovering what Ferris had done, Zara had lost her workshop, her apartment, her credit, and her ability to work legally in the industry she had spent her adult life mastering. She was 32 years old. She was Lebanese, born in Beirut and raised in the immigrant quarter of this city by parents who had fled a war and built a life from the same raw materials that all immigrants use: work, sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to be defeated by circumstances. Her father had been a tailor. Her mother had been a seamstress. She had grown up in a household where fabric was a second language, where the sound of a sewing machine was the soundtrack to dinner and homework and bedtime stories, where she had learned to thread a needle before she learned to tie her shoes. She was small, 5'2", with a compact frame that belied a physical toughness, forged by years of work that required both delicacy and endurance. She had thick black hair that she wore in a single braid that reached the middle of her back, secured with a piece of ribbon she changed weekly, the one vanity she permitted herself even in homelessness. Her skin was warm olive, tanned from sleeping rough in the months before she found St. Agatha's. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, with the particular intensity of someone who sees the world in terms of detail, of stitches and seams and the way fabric falls across a body. Her hands were her masterpiece, small, precise, calloused at the fingertips from years of needlework, with short, clean nails and a strength in the fingers that could push a needle through 6 layers of silk without faltering. She had found St. Agatha's on a night in December when the temperature had dropped below 0 and the shelters were full, and the streets offered the kind of cold that does not simply chill the body but enters it, colonizes it, turns the blood sluggish and the thoughts slow. She had tried the church door out of desperation and found it unlocked. Father Matteo left it unlocked on cold nights, a quiet act of institutional mercy that the diocese would not have approved, but that his conscience required, and she had slipped inside and found the vestry and made a bed between the shelves and slept in the warmth of a building that had been heated by faith and gas radiators for over a century. Father Mateo discovered her the next morning. He was a man in his 60s with white hair and the kind of face that looks like it was designed for compassion. Soft eyes, deep lines from smiling, hands that were always open. He looked at the woman sleeping in his vestry with her professional sewing kit rolled beside her like a soldier's weapon, and he did not call the police. He brought her coffee and a bread roll from the kitchen, and he sat on a storage crate and waited for her to wake, and when she opened her dark eyes and saw a priest sitting across from her with coffee and bread and no judgment on his face, she wept, not from gratitude, though she was grateful, but from the particular relief of being seen by someone who did not look away. Father Mateo gave her permission to stay, unofficially, informally, in the manner of a man who understood that the rules of the church and the laws of compassion did not always align, and that when they conflicted, compassion was the higher authority. Zara, in return, made herself useful. She cleaned the vestry. She polished the brass candlesticks. She mended the altar cloths that had developed tears from years of use, repairing them with stitches so fine and so precise that Father Mateo held the repaired fabric up to the light and shook his head in wonder and said, "You could mend the robes of the saints themselves." She had been at St. Agatha's for 5 months when she found the box. 5 months during which she had built a life from the architecture of routine and usefulness that keeps a person from dissolving when everything solid has been taken away. She woke every morning at 5:30, before Father Mateo, before the first light entered the vestry window. She rolled her bedding tightly and stored it behind the shelves, where it could not be seen by anyone who might enter the vestry during the day. The diocesan inspector, the altar guild, the volunteers who organized the charity drives. Her existence in the church was known only to Father Mateo, and she intended to keep it that way, because visibility was vulnerability, and she had learned that lesson in ways she did not care to revisit. She washed in the small bathroom adjacent to the sacristy, using cold water and a bar of soap she replaced weekly from the pharmacy on Via Settembre. She dressed in the same rotation of practical clothing: 2 pairs of dark trousers, 3 thermal shirts, the gray wool coat she had mended so many times that the patches had become part of its identity, rather than evidence of damage. She braided her hair and tied it with the ribbon of the week. This week it was a deep burgundy, a scrap of silk she had found in a remnant bin at the fabric market, and the color pleased her because it was the color of certain threads in embroidery, the color of wine and old roses and warmth. By 6 o'clock she was working. She cleaned the vestry first, then the sacristy, then moved through the nave with a dustcloth and a broom, polishing the wood of the pews and sweeping the stone floor with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that cleanliness was not servility but stewardship. She repaired whatever needed repairing: a frayed hassock cushion, a torn hymnal cover, a loose button on one of the altar server's cassocks. The altar cloths were her special project. St. Agatha's had 8 linen altar cloths, the oldest dating from 1962, and every one of them bore the evidence of decades of use: small tears along the folds, thinning areas where the linen had been pressed too many times, hems that had come loose from years of being draped and removed and laundered and stored. She repaired them with the invisible stitches that were her signature, the stitches that Father Mateo marveled at, the stitches that made damaged things look as though damage had never occurred. In the afternoon, she mended clothing for the neighborhood women who came to the church's charity hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays. They came with children's school uniforms that needed letting out, with winter coats missing buttons, with wedding suits bought secondhand that required alteration. They paid what they could, sometimes coins, sometimes food, sometimes nothing, and Zara accepted whatever was offered, because the exchange was not transactional, but communal, a web of small kindnesses that sustained people who had fallen through the larger nets of institutional support. These women knew she was skilled. Word had spread through the quiet networks that exist among people who share the geography of difficulty, the food bank regulars, the shelter visitors, the church volunteers who recognized a face they had seen at the free clinic on Fridays. Zara Khoury could fix anything. Zara Khoury could turn a second-hand dress into something that looked bespoke. Zara Khoury's hands were magic, and she worked for whatever you could spare, and she never made you feel small for having torn clothes or no money, because she understood that circumstances were not character, and that a ripped seam said nothing about the person wearing the garment. She earned enough from these small repairs to buy food, soap, thread, and the occasional luxury. A new ribbon for her braid, a paper cup of coffee from the stand on the corner of Via Settembre and Piazza Luna, a second-hand book from the cart outside the used bookshop. She read voraciously, the way hungry people eat, quickly, thoroughly, without waste. She read in the vestry by lantern light after the church closed, novels and histories and biographies of artists whose work she admired, feeding her mind the way she fed her body, with whatever was available and whatever sustained her. She was, by any measure, a woman living in poverty, but she was not a woman living without purpose, and the distinction mattered to her more than the material reality of her circumstances. She had her skills, she had her routine, she had the respect of Father Matteo and the gratitude of the neighborhood women and the quiet satisfaction of falling asleep each night, knowing that her hands had done useful work. She was surviving, and surviving with dignity, and waiting, though she did not think of it as waiting, for something to change. The box was the change. If this story has already wrapped itself around you, if you can feel the weight of what's in that box and the hands that are about to open it, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales right now. Hit that notification bell, because what Zara does next is going to change everything. She opened the box on a Tuesday evening in March, when the church was empty and the vestry was lit by her battery-powered lantern and the fading light through the narrow window above the storage shelves. She had noticed the box during her first week in the vestry, but had respected its privacy, the way she respected the privacy of all the church's stored objects, the Christmas decorations, the extra hymnals, the boxes of candles and communion supplies that occupied the shelves with the ordered domesticity of a well-run household. But the box had been there for 3 weeks, untouched and curiosity, the specific curiosity of a craftwoman who can sense fabric through cardboard, the way a musician can sense an instrument through its case, drew her to it. She lifted the lid. She pulled back the rain-damaged tissue paper, and she saw the dress. Her hands went still. Her breath caught. Her dark eyes moved across the devastation of the silk with the clinical precision of a surgeon assessing a patient, cataloging the damage, evaluating the severity, calculating what could be saved and what was beyond repair. The bodice had been ripped from the skirt along the waistline seam. The pearl buttons had been torn free, leaving small wounds in the silk where the thread had pulled through. The embroidered hem had been partially shredded, several vines severed mid-pattern. The veil was in 3 pieces. The silver filigree comb was bent but intact. She lifted the bodice from the box and held it up to the lantern light, and the ivory silk glowed amber in the warm illumination, and she could see through the damage to the craftsmanship beneath, the precision of the original seams, the quality of the fabric, the extraordinary skill of the seamstress who had created this dress nearly half a century ago. This was not a mass-produced garment. This was handwork of the highest order, the product of someone who understood fabric, the way Zara understood fabric, who spoke the same language of thread and needle and the patient transformation of raw material into something sacred. She counted the pearl buttons in the box. 39. 4 were missing, lost on the bedroom floor, she imagined, rolled under furniture, stepped on and crushed, casualties of the violence that had been done to this dress. She would need to find matching buttons, or she would need to remove all the originals and replace them with a uniform set, which was unacceptable because the buttons were original and originals were irreplaceable, and a restorer's job was to preserve, not to substitute. She sat with the pieces for a long time, not touching them, not yet, first observing, the way a doctor observes a patient before deciding on a course of treatment. She turned each section of the dress over in the lantern light, examining the damage from every angle, cataloging not just what was broken, but how it had been broken, reading the violence in the torn edges the way a detective reads a crime scene. The bodice had been ripped downward, which meant someone had gripped the neckline and pulled. The buttons had been pried, not cut. The thread wounds were ragged, not clean. The embroidery had been torn by hand, impatiently, by someone searching for something hidden in the fabric. The veil had been the last casualty, ripped into 3 pieces with the careless efficiency of someone who had already found nothing and was destroying out of frustration rather than purpose. The damage told a story of greed and ignorance, but beneath the damage, the original dress told a story of love and extraordinary skill. And Zara, who had been reading stories in fabrics since she was old enough to hold a needle, knew which story deserved to survive. She would need to find 4 matching pearl buttons. She would need to repair the waistline seam, reattaching the bodice to the skirt in a way that was invisible, that respected the original construction, that did not add modern thread or modern technique to a garment that deserved to be repaired in the language it was made in. She would need to reconstruct the embroidered vines on the hem, studying the surviving pattern and extending it across the damaged sections with thread that matched the original in weight and color and sheen. She would need to reunite the 3 pieces of the veil and repair the tiers without leaving visible seams. She would need to straighten the filigree comb without breaking the delicate metalwork. She could do all of this. She could do it because this was what she had been trained to do, what she had spent 8 years doing in her workshop in the bridal district, what her father had taught her at his tailor's bench, and her mother had taught her at the sewing table, and what generations of her family's textile knowledge had prepared her for. She could repair this dress. She could make it whole again. She could take the pieces of someone's most precious memory and stitch them back together with the invisible precision of a woman whose hands were, quite literally, made for this work. She did not ask permission. She did not seek Father Mateo's blessing or attempt to contact the person who had left the box. She simply began. She spread the pieces of the dress across the vestry table like a puzzle, like a map of a country that had been torn apart and needed to be reassembled, and she threaded a needle with ivory silk thread from her professional kit, and she began to sew. She worked every night. After the church closed, after Father Mateo locked the main doors and went to his residence next door, after the last of the evening light faded from the vestry window and the only illumination was her battery-powered lantern and the distant glow of the sanctuary's eternal flame through the doorway, Zara sat at the vestry table and stitched. The bodice took 4 nights. She reattached it to the skirt using a technique her father had taught her, a hand-rolled seam that distributed the stress evenly across the fabric, invisible from the outside, strong enough to last another 40 years. She worked with the patience that restoration requires, the understanding that speed is the enemy of precision, and that every stitch must be placed not where it is easiest, but where it is needed, where the fabric tells you it wants to be joined. The pearl buttons took longer. She spent 2 days walking through the city's markets and second-hand shops during daylight hours, searching for 4 pearl buttons that matched the 39 originals. She found them in a vintage shop in the immigrant quarter, a jar of assorted buttons in a dusty corner, and among them 4 pearl buttons that were close enough in size and luster to pass as original. She bought them with coins she had earned mending clothes for other people who lived at the margins of the city. The invisible economy of small repairs and quiet skills that sustains people who have nothing but their hands and their knowledge. She sewed the buttons on one by one, matching the spacing and the thread tension of the original work, placing each button with the reverence of someone placing stones in a memorial. 43 buttons, one for each year of a grandmother's life. She did not know the story, not yet, but she could feel it in the dress. The weight of memory, the density of meaning, the way certain objects absorb the love of the people who cherish them and become more than the sum of their materials. Emilio learned about the restoration because Father Mateo called him. The call came on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after Zara had begun her work. Father Mateo's voice carried the particular quality of cautious wonder that accompanies witnessing something you cannot fully explain. "Emilio, you should come see the dress." "I don't want to see it, Father." "You do. Trust me, you do." Emilio sent Luca first, because sending Luca first was what he did, a buffer between himself and anything that might breach the fortifications of his composure. Luca went to the church. Luca came back. Luca stood in Emilio's study with an expression that Emilio had never seen on his face in 15 years of service. An expression that combined awe and tenderness in a way that looked foreign on the features of a man whose primary professional skill was intimidation. "Boss," Luca said, "you need to see this yourself." Emilio went to the church. He had not been inside St. Agatha's since his mother's funeral, and crossing the threshold felt like stepping backward in time into the smell of incense and old stone and candle wax that had been the smell of his childhood, the smell of Sundays with Rosa, the smell of the woman who had raised him alone after his father's death and who had taught him that strength without gentleness was just violence with better posture. Father Mateo led him to the vestry. The dress was laid across the table, reassembled, the pieces reconnected with stitches so fine they were invisible to the naked eye. The bodice was whole again, attached to the skirt along a waistline seam that looked original. The pearl buttons marched in their precise line from nape to small of back, 43 of them, and Emilio counted them because his mother had always counted them when she showed him the dress, and the count was right, and the buttons gleamed in the vestry light as if they had never been torn from their threads. The embroidered hem was still in progress, perhaps 2/3 complete, the restored vines indistinguishable from the originals, the new thread matching the old in color and weight, and the subtle sheen that silk thread develops after decades of careful storage. The veil lay beside the dress, 2 of its 3 pieces already reunited, the seam invisible, the tulle smooth and unbroken. Emilio looked at the dress and felt something rise in his chest that was too large for the room. He pressed his hand against his mouth and closed his eyes and stood in the vestry of the church where his mother had been married and felt the grief and the gratitude collide inside him like 2 waves meeting from opposite directions, creating a column of water that rose higher than either wave alone. "Who did this?" he asked, and his voice was not steady. "A woman," Father Mateo said. "She's been staying in the vestry. She's a seamstress. She found the box and she began working on it. I didn't know she was doing it until I came in one morning and found her asleep at the table with a needle still in her hand." "She lives here, in the church?" "She's homeless, Emilio. She lost everything through no fault of her own. She sleeps here because I would rather have a woman of extraordinary skill and good character sleeping in my vestry than freezing in the streets. She has been repairing altar cloths and vestments for months. She mends clothing for other people in need. And when she found your mother's dress, she began restoring it without being asked, without knowing who it belonged to, without any expectation of payment or recognition. She did it because the dress needed to be repaired, and she had the skills to repair it. That's the kind of woman she is." Emilio looked at the dress again. He looked at the stitches, the invisible, meticulous, loving stitches that had reconnected the pieces of his mother's most precious possession with a skill that bordered on the miraculous. He looked at the pearl buttons and the reconstructed vines and the healing veil, and he understood that this was not simply a repair. This was an act of devotion performed by a stranger on an object whose significance she could not have known, an act that required not just technical skill, but emotional intelligence, the ability to sense the love embedded in a garment, and to honor it with work that was worthy of that love. "I want to meet her," he said. "She'll be here tonight. She works after the church closes. She's shy, Emilio. She's proud, Don't come in your suit with your car and your men. Come as Rosa's son. That's who she'll respond to." Emilio looked at Father Mateo, and something passed between them that was older than their professional acquaintance, older than the complicated relationship between a priest and a man whose income came from territories and operations that the church's moral framework could not accommodate. Something that went back to the boy who had sat in the front pew every Sunday with his mother, who had received communion from this priest's hands, who had been taught by this man and by Rosa that the measure of a person is not what they take from the world, but what they give back to it. "I'll come tonight," he said, alone. We're in the heart of this story now, and everything is about to shift. If you can already feel the pull between these two people, the man whose world is built on power and the woman whose power is in her hands, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales right now. Hit that like button, drop a comment, because this story is about to take you somewhere beautiful. He came at 9 in the evening, after the church had closed and the streets of the old quarter had settled into the particular quiet of a weeknight. Restaurants winding down, apartment windows glowing, the distant sound of the sea that was the city's permanent background music. He wore dark trousers and a simple black sweater. No overcoat, no watch, nothing that announced wealth or authority. He let himself in through the side door that Father Mateo had left unlocked, and he walked through the nave of the church where he had been baptized and confirmed, and where his mother's funeral mass had been held 14 months ago, and the ghosts of all those ceremonies brushed against him like cobwebs as he passed. Light was coming from the vestry, a warm, lantern-colored light that spilled through the doorway and across the stone floor of the sacristy in a golden rectangle. He stopped at the threshold and looked in. She was sitting at the vestry table, bent over the dress, her hands moving with a fluidity and a precision that he recognized as mastery, the particular quality of motion that occurs when a skill has been practiced so long that it has moved from the conscious mind to the body itself, from thought to instinct, from effort to grace. Her black braid hung over one shoulder. Her face was lit by the lantern from below, casting upward shadows that accentuated her cheekbones and the concentration in her dark eyes. She was sewing the embroidered vines on the hem, her needle moving through the silk with the rhythm of a heartbeat, in, through, pull, repeat, and the thread followed the needle like a line of gold in the warm light, extending the vine pattern across the repaired section of fabric with an accuracy that seemed impossible for a human hand, working without magnification or guide. She did not hear him, or if she heard him, she did not stop, because stopping in the middle of a vine was like stopping in the middle of a word. It broke the continuity, disrupted the flow, left the work incomplete in a way that would show in the finished product. She finished the vine she was working on, a complete botanical curve from stem to leaf tip. And then she looked up. She saw a man standing in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark curly hair cropped close, and brown skin that the lantern light turned amber. His face was angular and strong, a prominent nose, a square jaw, dark eyes beneath thick brows that were, in this moment, drawn together in an expression she could not immediately read. He was perhaps 40, perhaps older, with the build of someone who had been physical in his youth and who now carried his body with the contained stillness of a man who no longer needed to prove what he was capable of. His hands, which hung at his sides, were large and scarred at the knuckles, and they were trembling. She looked at his face. She looked at the trembling hands. She looked at the doorway behind him, through which she could see the empty nave of the church, and the distant altar, and the eternal flame that burned in its red glass holder. And she understood, with the intuition of a woman who read emotion the way she read fabric, through texture and tension and the invisible forces that hold things together or pull them apart, that this man was the owner of the dress. "You're Rosa's son," she said. And her voice was quiet and accented with the particular music of Arabic inflected speech, the vowels round and warm, the consonants precise. How did you know? The dress told me, the way the buttons are spaced. The 43rd button is set slightly further from the 42nd than the pattern requires. It's intentional. Someone counted them and placed the last one deliberately, with extra space, as if giving it room to breathe. That's a mother's touch. That's someone who put meaning into the details. And you look at the dress the way I look at fabric I love, like it contains something alive. Emilio stood in the doorway and listened to this woman, this homeless woman sleeping in a church vestry, describe the emotional architecture of his mother's wedding dress with a perceptiveness that was almost painful in its accuracy, and he felt the last wall of his composure develop a crack that he could not repair. She would count the buttons every time she showed it to me, he said. Every time. 43, one for every year of her mother's life. Zara nodded. I found 39 in the box. I spent 2 days finding 4 replacements that matched. They're not perfect. The new ones are slightly warmer in tone than the originals, but in the light of a church on a wedding day, no one would know. I would know. Then I'll keep looking. I'll find perfect matches. It might take weeks, but I'll find them. She said this with the absolute certainty of someone who understood that perfection in restoration is not vanity but respect. Respect for the original maker, respect for the garment's history, respect for the love that had been stitched into every seam. She would find perfect buttons because the dress deserved perfect buttons, because Rosa's memory deserved perfection, because the 43 buttons were not decoration, but narrative, a story told in pearl, and every word of that story had to be right. Emilio walked into the vestry. He sat down across the table from her, the dress between them, and he looked at her work up close for the first time. The stitches were invisible. The reattachment of the bodice was flawless. The embroidered vines were being reconstructed with a fidelity to the original that suggested Zara had studied the surviving pattern with the attention that scholars bring to ancient texts. "How are you doing this?" he asked. "The embroidery. How are you matching the original so precisely?" She showed him. She had taken photographs of the surviving vine pattern with an old phone, cracked screen, held together with tape, and she had studied the photographs until she could reproduce the pattern from memory. She had matched the thread not by color alone, but by weight and twist, sourcing vintage silk thread from the same secondhand shops where she had found the buttons. She was not simply repairing the dress. She was speaking the original seamstress's language, continuing a conversation in thread that had been started in 1979 and interrupted by violence, and was now being resumed by a woman who had never met the original maker, but who understood her completely, the way musicians who have never met can play together by listening to the same internal rhythm. "My father was a tailor," Zara said. "My mother was a seamstress. I grew up in a house where fabric was sacred, where a well-made garment was treated the way other families treated art or music or books, as something that contains the maker's soul. This dress was made by someone who put their soul into it. I can feel it in the thread. I can feel it in the way the seams are placed. Whoever made this dress loved the woman who would wear it. A seamstress in the old quarter. My mother never knew her name." She didn't need to know the name. The dress is the name. The work is the identity. I know this seamstress the way I know my own mother, through the language of her hands. They sat in the vestry of St. Agatha's church. The wedding dress of Rosa Saranova spread between them like a bridge connecting 2 worlds that should never have intersected, the world of a Mafia boss and the world of a homeless seamstress. And the lantern light made the ivory silk glow between them like something alive, like something that was not merely being repaired, but being resurrected. Emilio came back the next night, and the night after. He came to the church every evening at 9, after the doors were locked and the streets were quiet, and he sat in the vestry and watch Zara work and talk to her about his mother. The first night, he said almost nothing. He sat on the storage crate that Father Matteo used as an impromptu chair and watched Zara work on the embroidered hem, and the only sound in the vestry was the whisper of silk thread passing through fabric and the distant hum of the church's heating system cycling on and off. He stayed for 2 hours. When he left, he said, "Thank you," in a voice that carried the weight of everything he could not yet articulate, and Zara nodded without looking up from her work, because she understood that some conversations begin in silence and that the words come later, when the silence has done its job. The second night, he brought coffee, 2 paper cups from the stand on the corner of Via Settembre, the one that stayed open late for the restaurant workers and the insomniacs, and the people whose schedules did not conform to the city's conventional rhythms. He placed 1 cup beside Zara's sewing kit without interrupting her work, and she picked it up and sipped without stopping her needle, and the gesture, the giving and receiving of coffee without ceremony, established a baseline of domesticity between them that felt both natural and entirely new. The third night, he began to talk. He told her about Rosa's hands, how they had been rough from years of cleaning other people's houses, from the bleach and the hot water and the physical labor that had funded his childhood. He told her how Rosa had saved for 2 years to afford the wedding dress, putting aside small amounts from every paycheck, hiding the money in a tin behind the flour canister in the kitchen, because banks were for people who had enough money to feel comfortable with institutions, and Rosa was not that kind of person. He told her how the dress had been the most expensive thing Rosa ever owned, more expensive than any piece of furniture or appliance or jewelry, because Rosa understood, the way Zara understood, that some objects transcend their material value and become containers for something that money cannot buy. Zara listened. She sewed and she listened, and her hands moved with the automatic precision of someone performing a task so familiar that it required no conscious thought, freeing her mind to receive the stories that Emilio was telling her, with the hunger of a man who had not spoken about his mother to anyone since the funeral. She listened the way she sewed, with attention, with patience, with the understanding that the process was as important as the product. She told him about her own life in return, about Beirut, about the war her parents had fled, about the apartment in the immigrant quarter where she had grown up surrounded by fabric and thread and the sound of sewing machines. She told him about her workshop in the bridal district, about the 8 years she had spent building a reputation, about the brides who had come to her for alterations and custom work, and who had left wearing garments that made them feel beautiful in a way that was specific and personal, not the generic beauty of mass production, but the intimate beauty of something made for your body alone. She told him about Ferris, about the debts, the forgery, the discovery, the eviction, the collapse. She told the story without self-pity, without asking for sympathy, with the straightforward honesty of a woman who had been knocked down and was not ashamed of it, because being knocked down was not a character flaw, it was a circumstance, and circumstances could be changed if you had the right tools and the willingness to use them. Emilio listened to the story of Ferris with a stillness that was different from his usual composure. It was the stillness of controlled anger, the particular immobility of a man who had spent his entire adult life solving problems through direct action, and who was now being told about a problem he could not solve without violating the trust of the woman telling him about it. She saw the change in his jaw, the tightening of the muscles along the line where his neck met his shoulders, and she knew what he was thinking because she had learned to read him the way she read fabric, through tension and texture and the subtle shifts that indicate stress beneath the surface. "Don't," she said, reading his thoughts before he formed them into words. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to offer to find him, to make him pay. I can see it in your hands." He looked down at his hands. They were clenched on the edge of the table, the knuckles white, the old scars standing out against his brown skin like roads on a map. He unclenched them deliberately, spreading his fingers flat on the wood. "It's a reasonable thing to want," he said carefully. "It's your kind of justice, not mine. My kind of justice is this." She held up the needle. "My kind of justice is surviving. Being here. Doing work that matters, letting Ferris carry the weight of what he did without adding violence to it. Violence doesn't repair things, Emilio. It tears them further. I should know. I've spent my whole life fixing what violence and carelessness destroy." He looked at her across the table, and in the lantern light her face was fierce and certain and unbowed, and he understood that her refusal to accept revenge was not weakness, but the deepest kind of strength. The strength of a person who knows exactly who they are and will not compromise that identity for the satisfaction of seeing an enemy punished. On the nights that followed, their conversations deepened the way rivers deepen, slowly through the persistent movement of shared experience wearing away at the stone of reserve and formality that separates two people who are learning each other. She taught him about fabric. She showed him the difference between silk and satin by touch, made him close his eyes and run his fingers across swatches from her collection of remnants, and he discovered that his large, scarred hands could feel distinctions he had never imagined. The cool weight of charmeuse, the structured grip of dupioni, the impossible softness of chiffon that slid between his fingers like water. He taught her about his world, not the violence of it, which she did not want to know and he did not want to share, but the structure of it, the economics of territory, the social contracts that bound his organization together, the debts of loyalty that were more binding than any legal agreement, the code that his mother had insisted upon. That power was a responsibility, not a privilege, and that a man who controlled a neighborhood owed that neighborhood protection and prosperity in equal measure. Rosa's ethics had shaped his organization more than any strategic calculation, and telling Zara about his mother's influence was, he realized, the closest he had ever come to sharing the private architecture of his life with another human being. One night, the fourth week, a Wednesday, when the rain was hitting the vestry window so hard that it sounded like an audience applauding, Zara was working on the final section of the veil, reuniting the last two pieces of tulle with stitches so fine that even under the lantern's magnification they were barely visible. Emilio was watching her hands, as he always did, and he said something that surprised them both. "My mother's hands looked like yours when she worked. Not the same shape. Her fingers were longer, broader, but the same concentration, the same certainty. She could look at a dirty floor and see exactly what needed to be done, and her hands would move before her mind gave the order, because the knowledge was in the muscle, in the bone. She used to say her hands were smarter than her head." Zara's needle paused. She looked up at him, and in the amber light her dark eyes held something that was not pity and not sympathy, but something harder to name. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition that this man, for all his power and his territory and his men who called him boss, was a son who missed his mother's hands the way she missed her father's voice, counting stitches aloud at his tailoring bench. They were both children of working hands, and that shared inheritance ran deeper than the differences that separated their worlds. "My father used to count his stitches out loud," she said, in Arabic. "Wahid, Ithnain, Thalitha." I can still hear him. Some nights when I'm sewing, I count in his voice instead of mine. The rain hammered the vestry window, and the lantern flickered, and the two of them sat in the warmth of shared memory. Two people who had lost the people who made them, and who were finding in each other's stories the echo of what they missed. "My tools are my hands," she said, holding them up in the lantern light, small, calloused, precise, the hands of a woman who could repair a wedding dress from 1979 with invisible stitches and matching pearl buttons. "Everything else was taken from me, But they couldn't take my hands. They couldn't take what my parents taught me. They couldn't take the knowledge that lives here. She pressed her fingertips together. This is mine. This can't be repossessed or foreclosed or stolen. This is who I am. Emilio looked at her hands. He looked at the dress on the table. He looked at this woman. This small, fierce, proud woman who slept in a church vestry and mended altar cloths and restored strangers' heirlooms without asking for payment because the work itself was sufficient reward. And he felt something shift in the architecture of his life, a load-bearing wall relocating, a new room opening up in a structure he had thought was complete. He was not a man who fell in love easily. He was not a man who fell in love at all, in the conventional sense. His life had been organized around his mother, his organization, and the strategic alliances that kept both secure. Women had existed in his life as arrangements, as companionships of convenience, as brief encounters that served physical needs without engaging emotional ones. He had never met a woman who made him feel what Zara was making him feel. Not desire, not attraction in the simple sense, but something more fundamental, recognition. The recognition that this person, this specific human being, with her braid and her sewing kit, and her damaged hands and her undamaged dignity, was someone he wanted to know completely, someone whose presence made the world make more sense. He offered her money. She refused. He offered her a place to stay, an apartment, a workshop, whatever she needed. She refused. He offered to find Ferris and make him answer for what he had done, and the way he said it made clear that answer carried implications that went beyond legal proceedings, and she refused that too, firmly, with the particular clarity of a woman who understood exactly what he was offering and wanted no part of the violence it implied. "Finish the dress," she said. "Let me finish the dress. That's all I need right now. The rest, the money, the apartment, the revenge, that's your language. This is mine." She held up the needle. "Let me speak it." He let her. He sat in the vestry every night and watched her speak the language of thread and silk and precision, and he fell in love with her the way thread falls through fabric, quietly, naturally, following the path that the needle creates, going where the work requires. The dress took 6 weeks to restore completely. On the final night, Zara placed the last stitch in the last vine of the embroidered hem and held the dress up to the lantern light and turned it slowly, examining every seam, every button, every inch of restored fabric with the critical eye of a craftswoman who knows that the difference between good work and great work is invisible to everyone except the maker. It was perfect. Not new. The dress still carried its 44 years of history in the subtle patina of the silk, in the slight yellowing that age brings to ivory, in the softness of fabric that has been stored and loved and touched by generations of careful hands. But it was whole. The violence that had been done to it had been erased, not through denial, but through skill, through the patient accumulation of stitches that had reconnected what had been torn apart and restored what had been damaged. Zara found the 4 perfect pearl buttons on the last day. A woman at the vintage market, an old Italian woman who sold estate jewelry from a folding table, had 4 pearl buttons from the same era, the same size, the same warm luster. They cost more than Zara could afford, and she paid for them with money she had earned mending clothes for the neighborhood women who came to the church on Tuesdays, the invisible economy of skill and need that sustained her, and she sewed them into their places, buttons 39 through 42, positioned with the same spacing as the originals, and the line was complete. 43 pearl buttons, one for each year of Rosa's mother's life. Everyone in place. She laid the dress on the vestry table for the last time. She placed the restored veil beside it. She straightened the silver filigree comb, which she had bent back into shape using pliers wrapped in cloth to protect the metal work. She stepped back and looked at the complete garment in the lantern light, and she felt the particular exhaustion that follows the completion of a significant work. not physical tiredness, but the emptying out of creative energy, the feeling of having poured everything you have into an object and having nothing left for yourself. Emilio arrived at 9. He walked into the vestry and saw the dress and stopped breathing. It was his mother's dress, not the ruins of his mother's dress, not the approximation of his mother's dress, not a repaired version that carried visible evidence of its trauma. It was the dress that Rosa Saranova had worn on the happiest day of her life, restored to the state it had been in when she placed it in the cedar chest 44 years ago. Every button in place, every vine blooming along the hem, the veil cascading from the silver comb like water falling from a height. He reached out and touched the silk. The fabric was cool and smooth under his fingers, and the feel of it, the specific texture of old silk that has been stored in lavender and tissue paper, transported him back 30 years to his mother's bedroom, to the cedar chest, to the ceremony of the lifted lid and the parted tissue and the counting of the buttons. 43. He counted them now, his finger moving from button to button, and the count was right. And when he reached the 43rd button, set slightly further from the 42nd, given room to breathe, his mother's deliberate touch, he pressed his palm flat against the silk and closed his eyes and felt Rosa's presence in the fabric like warmth stored in stone. "It's done," Zara said quietly from behind him. He turned. She was standing by the shelves where she slept, her sewing kit rolled and tucked under her arm, her bedroll already packed. She was leaving. She was planning to leave now that the work was finished, to disappear back into the streets and the margins and the invisible life that homelessness imposes on people who deserve better. "Where are you going?" he asked, and his voice carried an edge that surprised them both. Not anger, but urgency, the sound of a man who has just understood that something precious is about to walk out of his life. "The dress is finished. There's no reason for me to stay." "There's every reason for you to stay." "Emilio, listen to me." He stepped toward her, and his large frame filled the vestry in a way that should have been intimidating, but wasn't, because his hands were shaking again, the way they had shaken the first night, and the trembling made him human in a way that his reputation never could. "My mother believed that the measure of a person is what they give. Not what they take, not what they control, not what they accumulate, what they give. You have given me back the most important thing I've ever lost, and you did it for nothing. You did it because the dress needed to be repaired, and you had the skills to repair it. That's what my mother would have done. That's exactly what she would have done." Zara looked at him. She looked at the dress on the table. She looked at the vestry that had been her home for 5 months, the narrow space between the shelves where she had slept, the table where she had worked every night by lantern light, repairing a stranger's heirloom with hands that carried generations of knowledge and skill. "Your mother sounds like she was extraordinary," Zara said. "She was, and so are you. And I'm not going to stand here and watch you walk back into the streets with a sewing kit under your arm when I have the ability to change that. Not as charity. Don't look at me like that. Not as charity. As recognition. You have a skill that no one in this city can match. My mother's dress proves it. I want to set you up with a workshop, a real workshop in the old quarter, near where you grew up, a place where you can work and live and build back what was taken from you. And I want you to know that this is not about the dress. This is about the woman who repaired it. This is about the way you count buttons and match thread and fall asleep with a needle in your hand. This is about the fact that I've spent 6 weeks sitting in this vestry, watching you work, and I am not the same man I was when I walked in." The silence in the vestry was the silence of a decision being made. Not the strategic decisions that Emilio made every day in his professional life, decisions of territory and alliance and calculated consequence. This was a different kind of decision, the kind that changes the shape of a life, that opens a door that was previously invisible, that requires not strategy but courage. Zara set her sewing kit on the table. She unrolled it, and the needles and thread and shears gleamed in the lantern light. The tools of her craft, the instruments of her identity, the only things she had kept from her old life, because they were the only things worth keeping. "I have conditions," she said. "Name them." "The workshop is mine, not yours. My name on the lease, my name on the door. I won't be a kept woman, and I won't be a gift. I'll pay you back every cent when I'm able. And Ferris, you leave him alone. Whatever he deserves, it's not your kind of justice to deliver. That's my condition. That's my line." Emilio looked at this woman, 5'2", 110 pounds, sleeping in a church vestry with a sewing kit and a bedroll, laying down terms to a man who controlled the eastern territories of the city, setting boundaries that his lieutenants would never have dared to set, and he felt the crack in his composure widen into something that was not a crack at all, but an opening, a window, a way into a room he had not known existed inside himself. "Agreed," he said. "All of it." She held out her hand, not for him to hold. Not yet, not in the romantic sense. That would come later, slowly, built stitch by stitch the way the dress had been rebuilt, with patience and precision, and the understanding that some things cannot be rushed without being ruined. She held out her hand for him to shake, a business agreement, a partnership between a man whose power was in his name and a woman whose power was in her hands. He took her hand. Her grip was strong, stronger than he expected, the grip of a woman whose fingers had pushed needles through 6 layers of silk for 20 years, the grip of a woman who had lost everything and held on to the only thing that mattered. They shook hands in the vestry of St. Agatha's church, with Rosa's wedding dress spread between them like a covenant, like a promise, like the physical proof that broken things can be made whole if someone cares enough to sit down and do the work. The weeks that followed the handshake were a different kind of restoration, not of fabric, but of a life. Emilio kept his word. He found a space in the old quarter, 3 blocks from where Zara had grown up, on a narrow street called Via dei Tessitori, the Street of Weavers, that had once been home to textile workers and tailors and seamstresses before the rents rose, and the artisans moved to cheaper neighborhoods or closed their doors entirely. The shop was on the ground floor of a building from the 1920s, with high ceilings and tall front windows that let in the kind of natural light that fabric work demands. Even consistent without glare, the light that allows you to see true color and match threads without deception. It needed work. The previous tenant had been a greengrocer, and the space smelled of produce and damp cardboard and the particular sadness of a commercial space that has been abandoned. Emilio offered to send a crew to renovate it. Zara refused. She wanted to do it herself, not all of it. She was practical enough to hire a plumber and an electrician, but the painting, the shelving, the arrangement of the space, the transformation from abandoned shop to working studio. This was her workshop, and every surface would carry the imprint of her decisions. She spent 3 weeks on the renovation. She painted the walls a warm cream that would not compete with the colors of the fabrics she would display. She built shelving along one wall from reclaimed wood, sanding each plank by hand until it was smooth enough to hold silk without snagging. She found the long cutting table at a salvage yard, a massive piece of oak that had served as a dining table in a restaurant that had closed, scarred and stained but solid. The kind of table that could bear the weight of a bolt of fabric and a seamstress leaning on it for 12 hours without complaint. She sanded it, oiled it, and positioned it in the center of the workshop where the light was best. She sourced her initial inventory from the markets she knew. The fabric vendors at the Saturday market near Piazza Luna, the remnant bins at the textile warehouses on the waterfront, the estate sales and secondhand shops where beautiful fabrics sometimes appeared among the ordinary ones like gems in a riverbed. She could not afford to stock the workshop the way her old bridal district studio had been stocked, with bolts of French lace and Italian silk ordered from suppliers who delivered on 30-day terms. She built her inventory the way she had rebuilt Rosa's dress. Carefully, patiently, one piece at a time, choosing quality over quantity, building something real from whatever she could find and afford. Father Mateo came to see the workshop during its final week of renovation. He stood in the doorway and looked at the cream walls and the oak table and the shelves beginning to fill with fabric and the sewing machine, a professional model, second-hand but serviced and reliable, that Zara had found through a contact in the garment district. And he crossed himself and said a quiet prayer and told Zara that watching her build this workshop was the closest he had come to witnessing a miracle in 40 years of priesthood. "Miracles involve the supernatural, Father," Zara said, measuring a shelf with her tailor's tape. "And what do you call a woman who sleeps in a church, repairs a stranger's wedding dress, and builds a workshop from nothing? If that's not supernatural, I need to revise my theology." 3 months after the handshake, Zara opened her workshop. The sign above the door read "Khoury and Thread" in gold lettering that she had commissioned from a calligrapher in the old quarter. The workshop was small but beautiful, with good light and a long cutting table and shelves of fabric that she had sourced from the same markets where she had found the pearl buttons. She hung Rosa's dress, with Emilio's permission, in a glass case in the entrance, not as a trophy, but as a testament, a sign that read, "Every garment tells a story. This one told me mine." Emilio came to the workshop every Thursday evening. He brought dinner from the restaurant his mother had loved, and they ate together at the cutting table among the fabric and the thread and the tools of Zara's trade. And he told her stories about Rosa, and she told him stories about Beirut, and the conversation between them grew the way embroidery grows. Detail by detail, color by color, each evening adding another vine to the pattern they were creating together. The workshop became known. Word spread through the old quarter the way it had spread through the charity hours at St. Agatha's, quietly, personally, from woman to woman, from mother to daughter, from neighbor to colleague. Zara Khoury could alter a wedding dress so perfectly that the bride's mother would weep. Zara Khoury could repair a family heirloom that 3 other seamstresses had declared unsalvageable. Zara Khoury worked with the kind of precision that made you feel your garment was not merely being fixed, but being honored. The brides came first, young women from the old quarter who could not afford custom gowns from the bridal district, but who had found second-hand dresses in vintage shops, in their mother's closets, in estate sales, that needed alteration. Zara transformed these dresses with the same skill and attention she had given Rosa's gown, and the bride stood on the fitting platform she had built in the back of the workshop and looked at themselves in the tall mirror and saw themselves as beautiful. And Zara understood that this moment of transformation, this quiet alchemy of fabric and skill, and the trust a woman places in the hands that dress her for the most important day of her life, was why she had endured everything. Not for the money, though the money was coming. Not for the reputation, though the reputation was growing. For the look on a woman's face when she sees herself made whole. Then came the restoration clients. Word of Rosa's dress had spread, not through Emilio, who was pathologically private about his personal life, but through Father Mateo, who was constitutionally incapable of keeping a good story to himself. He told the parish told the neighborhood told the city, and within 2 months of opening, Zara had a waiting list of clients with damaged heirlooms, christening gowns with acid stains, first communion dresses with moth holes, wedding veils yellowed by improper storage, vintage garments that carried decades of family history in their seams and needed the hands of someone who understood that a garment's value was not in its fabric, but in its memory. She was earning money, real money, consistent money, the kind of money that allows a person to pay rent and buy groceries and set aside a small amount each month toward the debt that Ferris had left behind. She had contacted a lawyer, a woman recommended by one of the charity hour regulars, and the legal process of untangling Ferris's forgeries and establishing Zara's innocence was underway. It would take time. It would take patience. But the trajectory had changed. The line that had been going down, from workshop to street, from solvency to homelessness, from dignity to survival, had reversed, and the line was now going up, stitched upward by the same hands that had rebuilt a wedding dress from ruins. Emilio watched the transformation with the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent his life building structures, organizational structures, financial structures, structures of loyalty and territory, and who now watched someone build a structure that was entirely her own, that owed nothing to his methods or his world, that was made from different materials entirely. He had provided the space and the initial investment. Everything else, the clients, the reputation, the late nights cutting fabric and pinning hems and hand-finishing details that a machine could do faster, but that a machine could never do as well. That was Zara. That was entirely, completely, undeniably Zara. He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday in November, standing in the workshop with the city dark outside and the cutting table between them and Rosa's dress, glowing in its glass case like a lantern. He kissed her carefully, the way you handle precious fabric, with awareness of its fragility, with respect for its history, with the understanding that what you hold in your hands is irreplaceable and must be treated accordingly. She kissed him back with the precision and the warmth and the quiet confidence of a woman who had rebuilt a wedding dress from ruins and could certainly build a love from the raw materials of trust and honesty, and the shared understanding that the most powerful things in the world are not weapons or money or territory, but the invisible stitches that hold broken things together. She pulled back and looked at him. This tall, powerful, grieving man who had walked into a vestry and found his mother's dress being healed by a stranger's hands, and she placed her palm flat against his chest, over his heart, the way she placed her palm flat against fabric to feel its weight and its warmth and its capacity to hold shape under pressure. "Your mother would have liked me," she said. "My mother would have loved you. She would have sat in that chair and asked you to teach her the stitch you used on the pearl buttons, and she would have talked your ear off and fed you until you couldn't move, and told you that her son was difficult but worth the trouble." "Is he worth the trouble?" Emilio looked at the glass case where Rosa's dress hung restored and radiant, every button in place, every vine blooming along the hem, the work of a woman who had nothing but her hands and her knowledge and her refusal to let beautiful things stay broken. "I'm trying to be," he said. Zara smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile fully, not the small practical smile of a woman completing a task, or the polite smile of a woman accepting payment for her work, but a real smile, wide and warm, that transformed her concentrated face into something luminous. And Emilio understood, with the sudden clarity of a man who has been walking, in fog and steps, into sunlight, that this was the face he wanted to see every day for the rest of his life. Thank you for staying with Zara and Emilio through every stitch of this story. Thank you for understanding that skill is its own form of dignity, that the hands that repair are as powerful as the hands that destroy, and that love can begin in the most unexpected places. A church vestry, a cardboard box, a dress torn apart and stitched back together by a woman who had nothing but her hands and her heart. If this story moved you, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who builds things, who fixes things, who refuses to throw away what can be saved. Drop a comment telling me, what object in your life carries the most meaning? I read every single one. Until next time, remember, the strongest thread is the one that holds through the tear. Be that thread for someone.